Sherlock Holmes is drawn to a case where a firefly, frozen forever in amber, becomes the key to unlocking a crime buried in time. What seems like a trinket of nature hides a trail of obsession, deceit, and a truth that refuses to stay trapped. Chapter 1. The impossible crimite was in the waning days of a chill November. That I recall the singular affair of the firefly trapped in amber, a case as peculiar as any. In the long annals of my association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the fog had settled in the streets of London like a velvet curtain, muffling sound and masking form, and the gaslights of Baker Street seemed to flicker with an unspoken apprehension. It was during such a dreary evening that a singular telegram arrived, shattering the dullness of our domestic tranquility. Holmes had been sprawled across the settee all afternoon, the violin nestled at his side like a beloved pet, untouched save for a few restless pizzicato notes he had plucked in idle contemplation. I had been at the writing desk, attending to a medical paper long overdue, when Mrs. Hudson's soft rapping broke the silence. She bore a single telegram, her brow furrowed in that way which suggested the message it bore was no ordinary summons. Holmes took the envelope with the disinterest of a man handed a theater bill. But as his eyes moved across the page, his posture, sharpened like a blade honed against stone, he said nothing at first, merely handing me the telegram with an outstretched arm. It read, "Urgent. Lord Wexham found dead. The room is locked from within. No sign of forced entry. No weapon discovered. Impossible circumstances. Scotland Yard is at a loss. Your presence is required immediately. Inspector Tobias Gregson. A locked room death." I murmured, "How very Gothic. It sounds like something from one of Poe's stories." Holmes rose and moved to the window, drawing back the curtain to peer into the mist. Poe was a man of singular gifts, he said thoughtfully, but this smells not of fiction, but of misdirection. "And Lord Wexham?" I asked. "Is he known to you?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "Lord Julian Wexham. Yes, a reclusive patron of the arts and antiquities. Made a fortune in Indian textiles and retired to his Surrey estate, under the pretense of restoring medieval tapestries. But he had enemies, Watson. Quiet men often do. Within the hour, we were bundled in wool and en route to Wexham Manor by train, with Holmes lost in silent thought as the landscape flitted past in ghostly blurs. It was nearly midnight when we arrived at the gates of the estate, where a nervous constable met us beneath the flickering lanterns and ushered us quickly through the gravel paths that curved like veins toward the heart of the manor. The house was a great stone beast of a place, weathered, ivy-strangled, and with high Gothic windows like watchful eyes. Inside, Inspector Gregson waited by the great staircase, his usual briskness tempered by a troubled mien. "Holmes," he said, grasping his hand, "I've not seen the like of this in all my years. The room was locked from within. There's no way in or out." Holmes offered no greeting, merely gesturing. "Show me." Gregson led us up the central staircase and down a wide corridor, its floor covered with an Aubusson runner so plush our steps were muffled. He stopped before a great oak door reinforced with iron fittings. "This is it," he said. We forced the lock after the butler couldn't rouse him. Chain on the inside. No windows open. No secret passages. Place has been examined inch by inch. Holmes motioned for me to follow as he stepped into the chamber. The room was dominated by a heavy mahogany writing desk, on which lay a scattering of correspondence, a broken sealing wax stick, and an open ledger. To the left, a vast cabinet of curiosities loomed, its shelves displaying a strange collection of objects-carved idols, mummified birds, and, near the top, an amber orb no larger than a cricket ball, within which a firefly, long dead, lay suspended. Mid-flight. On the high-backed chair behind the desks at the lifeless form of Lord Wexham. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly agape, and his hands curled unnaturally on the armrests. There were no marks of violence on his person, no blood, no bruising, no sign of struggle. Cause of death? Holmes asked. Unknown. Gregson replied. Dr. Finley suspects poisoning, but no glass, no cup, no syringe, and nothing in the stomach so far. Holmes circled the room like a falcon tracing the updrafts, his eyes scanning every surface. He stopped before the cabinet of curiosities. This is his sanctuary, he muttered. Every collector has a private altar, and this, he pointed to the amber sphere, tapping it lightly, was the center of it. What is it? I asked. Baltic amber, Holmes replied. Prized for centuries. This one has a remarkable specimen trapped within, a firefly, quite rare. I wonder why display it here, rather than the study, where guests might see it. He turned to Gregson. Who discovered the body? The butler, Meeks, and Miss Imogen Wexham, his niece. She was due to inherit everything. Of course she was, Holmes said dryly. And where is Miss Wexham now? In her chambers. Quite distraught. Distraught, Holmes echoed. They usually are. Let no one leave the manor. Not until I've spoken to every soul within. These walls. He turned to me then, eyes gleaming. Watson, mark my words. There's more here than a locked door and a lifeless lord. This is not a puzzle of brute strength, but of rarefied cunning. Someone played a delicate hand, and I intend to trace the fingerprints left behind. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck 1, I felt a chill pass through me, not from the hour, but from the sensation that we had stepped into a trap not yet fully sprung. And at its center, like the firefly frozen in amber, lay a truth suspended, awaiting only Holmes to shatter the glass. Chapter 2. The arrival at Wexham Manor. Holmes and I did not speak, as we were led to our guest quarters by a red-faced footman, who scarcely concealed his unease. The hallway stretched long and shadowed, with paintings of unsmiling ancestors glowering from darkened frames. The very walls of Wexham Manor seemed to hold their breath. Somewhere in the upper floors, a woman sobbed faintly, a mournful sound barely rising above the ticking of the old clocks. Once inside the guest room, Holmes declined rest, instead pacing the floor in stockinged feet while I unstrapped my valise and pulled my notebook from its depths. He was lost in the machinery of his mind, head bowed slightly, brows drawn. Every few minutes, he would halt, turn, and resume his circuit with silent intensity. You believe the niece is involved? I ventured, opening a fresh page. Holmes paused, gazing at the hearth where a modest fire crackled. I believe, my dear Watson, that when a man of advanced years dies within a room locked from within, and does so absent any visible cause, the explanation must be neither simple nor ordinary. The niece, Miss Imogen Wexham, may be many things. Whether she is a murderer or a mourning kin remains to be seen. But the amber sphere? You seemed particularly interested. Holmes gave a small nod, indeed. A firefly, encased in resin for thousands of years, frozen in the act of living. Curious, don't you think, to surround oneself with emblems of death masquerading as beauty? Wexham's collection was not simply decorative. There was method in his taste. Men who collect the grotesque often do so to shield themselves from some inner truth. Before I could inquire further, there was a knock to precise raps and Inspector Gregson stepped inside. Holmes, he said, pulling up a chair, I thought it best to tell you this before you meet the niece. There's something odd in the servant's testimony. Holmes' eyes sharpened. Go on. The butler, Meeks, claims he heard Lord Wexham shouting with someone earlier in the evening, shortly before the house retired. Said it sounded heated, though he couldn't make out the words. With whom was he speaking? That's the thing. Meeks says he assumed it was a quarrel over the telephone, but the line to the manor's study was reported down since morning due to the storm. The operator confirmed no outgoing or incoming calls were registered after noon. Interesting. Holmes murmured. Was the voice he heard clearly that of Lord Wexham? Absolutely. And a second voice quieter, but male and tense. Like a servant, he said, or someone not used to arguing. Holmes folded his arms, staring into the fire as though it would yield the scene to his mind's eye. Either Meeks is mistaken, or he heard something he shouldn't have. Gregson nodded. He seems genuine, but he's old and half-blind. Holmes stood. Time, I think, to meet the lady of the manor. May I ask that you remain nearby, Inspector? I should like to observe her without the weight of official presence. Gregson gave a brief nod and left us. Within moments, Holmes and I were ascending the west staircase to the upper wing, where a housemaid led us to Miss Imogen Wexham's room. She knocked gently, and a soft voice bade us enter. Miss Wexham was seated at a writing desk beside the window. She rose when we entered, a shawl falling from her shoulders. Her face, pale and drawn, was framed by rich chestnut hair, swept hastily into a loose chignon. Her eyes gray, wide, and restless searched Holmes first, then me, before settling into a guarded calm. Mr. Holmes, I presume? Holmes gave a polite bow. And this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. She inclined her head but said nothing. May I begin by offering my condolences? Holmes said gently, Your uncle's passing must be a great shock. She nodded faintly. It is, though it is not entirely unexpected. Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. Not expected. He was, by all accounts, in good health. Her gaze drifted toward the frosted window. He was troubled, not in the body, but in the mind. He had become convinced that someone wished him harm. He spoke of it often at dinner, before bed. At first I thought it the ravings of age, but in the past week, he grew paranoid. He locked his study. He stopped accepting letters. He even accused me, his own niece, of spying on him. Holmes stepped forward. May I ask, was there any specific incident that prompted this fear? She hesitated. 2 weeks ago. A package arrived, unmarked. Inside was a moth, dead, pinned to a velvet cloth, and a note with a single line. The fire will find the amber heart. My pen froze mid-sentence. Holmes' expression did not change. Did your uncle share this with the authorities? No. He burned the note. But I saw it. And the moth, I believe he kept it, possibly in the cabinet. Holmes steepled his fingers. Tell me, Miss Wexham, do you know of anyone who would wish your uncle harm? She did not answer immediately. When she spoke, her voice was low. There was one man, Mr. Dorian Kell, an antiquities dealer. They had a falling out last year over the acquisition of a certain statue. My uncle accused him of forgery. Mr. Kell denied it. Of course, there were threats, letters, even talk of legal action. But then it quieted down. Has he been to the manor recently? No, not for over a year. But his name remained a sore point. Holmes nodded slowly. One final question, he said. Did your uncle ever mention the amber firefly? This time her reaction was not subdued. Her eyes widened a fraction, and she looked down at her hands. Yes, she said at last. He said it was the only perfect thing he owned. He believed it contained a soul, that it watched him. Holmes bowed. You have been most helpful, Miss Wexham. May I trouble you again tomorrow? She gave a tired nod. I'll be here. As we left the room, Holmes leaned close to me and whispered, Watson, what does it tell you? When a man fears his own possessions more than his enemies. I was still puzzling over the question when we reached the lower floor, and Holmes turned. To Gregson, we must speak with this Mr. Dorian Kell, at once. Chapter 3. A scene of deception. The following morning dawned cold and colorless. The garden grounds of Wexham Manor glazed in frost, every branch and hedgerow encased in a brittle shell of ice. A dull sun hung behind shifting clouds, casting pale light across the long windows of the manor. Holmes was already awake when I joined him in the dining hall, where breakfast had been laid but scarcely touched. He stood by the hearth, holding a slice of toast he had no intention of eating. His gaze trained on a crack in the stone mantel, as though it held the answer to the universe. "You slept poorly, Holmes," I observed. "I do not sleep when a locked door challenges my logic. Watson, either a man dies alone, or someone finds a way into a sealed room without disturbing the physical world. Both are impossible, therefore one must not be." He turned sharply, brushing crumbs from his fingers. "Come, let us return to the study. There's a deception there yet unmasked, and it waits for us to notice it." We found the study precisely as it had been left, sealed off under Gregson's supervision. The fire had long since died, leaving the grate cold, and Lord Wexham's body had been respectfully removed for post-mortem examination. Yet the room still bore the imprint of death, its air close and stifling, as though grief itself had taken root in the wood paneling. Holmes moved immediately to the amber sphere within the cabinet of curiosities, lifting it with both hands and holding it to the light. The firefly within, ancient and lifeless, was suspended in amber like a soul caught in a moment of despair. Holmes turned the orb slowly, then replaced it with a faint clink and moved on. "The symbolism," he said absently, "is almost too perfect." While he examined the cabinet, I focused on the desk, neat, yet curated. Like a museum exhibit, the ledger remained open to a half-written page of financial entries. The pen set carefully in its inkwell. An arrangement of correspondence was fanned to the right, a broken stick of red sealing wax to the left, but something struck me as odd. "Holmes," I called, "does anything here appear staged to you?" He was at my side in a flash. "Explain." I pointed. "The sealing wax, it's snapped clean in two. But there's no seal used on any of the letters here, and the wax is cold, brittle. It must have broken long before the rest of this arrangement was placed." Holmes gave a pleased hum and crouched beside the desk, opening a lower drawer. "Precisely. Watson, observe this wax is a different shade from the seals on the existing letters. This batch hasn't been used, and yet it was left broken atop the desk as though interrupted mid-use. That is theater. Someone wanted to stage the illusion of sudden death and ordinary activity disrupted by a final breath. But whoever it was, they did not take the time to realize their scene lacked internal logic." "And the ledger?" I asked. "It stops mid-line." Holmes flipped to the previous pages. "Entries are meticulous right up until the final page. This last line ends mid-word. That tells us Lord Wexham did not write it. It was forged either before the body was discovered or during the brief window between death and discovery. A clumsy hand sought to imitate his writing to suggest he was alive moments before death. But even in death, the body tells a truer story." We moved to the chair where Lord Wexham had been found, an upright, velvet-backed seat with thin carved legs and worn armrests. Holmes knelt to examine the area beneath it, eyes scanning the floorboards, his fingers trailing the edge of the skirting boards like a blind man reading Braille. "Dust," he muttered, "settles slowly in this room. Yet there are disruptions. See here, Watson. The edges of the rug have been shifted slightly. Someone moved the chair after death." He stood and gestured for me to watch. He dragged the chair gently to one side. Beneath it, embedded between the floorboards, lay a single, curved object no longer than a fingernail. Holmes plucked it up and placed it on his palm. "An insect's wing," he said softly, "delicate, transparent, and yet not from our friend in amber. This is fresh." I leaned in. "You believe it was planted?" Holmes shook his head. "On the contrary, I believe it fell during the murder." "But how?" Holmes did not answer. He paced toward the window and opened the heavy curtains. "Watson, what do you see out there?" I squinted into the pale light, the grounds, and yes, the conservatory. Holmes turned, lips thinning. Wexham's greenhouse was legendary among rare collectors, and he kept a private hothouse of live specimens, moths, fireflies, and other nocturnal insects from his expeditions. Most consider them trinkets, but to a mind obsessed with antiquity and preservation, their behavior light, instinct, movement becomes symbolic. He stepped away from the window and tapped the cabinet again. The firefly in amber was the prized possession. But what if someone turned the metaphor on its head? What if the killer sought to make Lord Wexham the firefly, trapped, preserved, displayed as a specimen? The notion chilled me. But how could one simulate such a death? The room was sealed. There was no sign of poison. Exactly, Holmes said, no sign. Which tells me we must stop looking for things that leave a trace, and begin seeking those which do not. A knock interrupted our musings. Gregson entered, looking harried. We've tracked Dorian Kell, he said. He's in London, denies any contact with Wexham, but he's agreed to meet us. Seems nervous. I thought you'd want to be there. Holmes nodded. We leave within the hour. But first, Gregson, have the conservatory examined. I want every living insect specimen accounted for. If a firefly is missing, we may have just found our murder weapon. Gregson blinked. You think he was killed by a firefly? No, Holmes said with an enigmatic smile. I think he was killed by someone who understood exactly what a firefly represents. And if I'm correct, the answer is not in what the eye sees but in what the light conceals. Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects. By the time we returned to the drawing room, the manor had begun to stir with a nervous vitality. The staff moved like shadows in the hallways, avoiding eye contact and conversation, while the ticking of the long case clock in the vestibule echoed with ominous rhythm. Holmes, ever alert to human theater, had already requested that the principal occupants of the household be assembled under one roof. They must be studied, Watson, he said as we descended the grand staircase. Not interrogated, not yet, merely observed. It is in silence that masks slip. We entered the drawing room to find Inspector Gregson already present, arms crossed, standing by the window that looked out over the skeletal garden. Before him, into long settees arranged in loose opposition, sat 5 individuals, each wrapped in the peculiar tension that comes from proximity to scandal. The first, seated upright with a studied elegance, was Miss Imogen Wexham, the deceased's niece. Her gray eyes, so steady the evening prior, now flicked about the room, refusing to land on any one person for long. Her dark skirt and morning blouse were pressed perfectly, but her hands folded in her lap betrayed a tremor. To her left, keeping a slight physical distance, sat a lean, sallow-faced man of about 30, introduced to us as Mr. Neville Blake, the estate's legal advisor. He's been Lord Wexham's solicitor for nearly 5 years, Gregson murmured to Holmes as we entered, and has a reputation for tactful discretion. On the opposing settee lounged 2 more figures. One was Mrs. Edna Barley, the formidable housekeeper whose iron-gray hair had been wound into a rigid coil. Her expression was unreadable save for a thin, perceptible twitch at the corner of her mouth whenever Imogen spoke. Next to her, sitting stiffly with his cap in hand, was Meeks, the elderly butler whose whispered testimony had first raised Holmes' suspicions. Finally, slightly apart from the rest and perched awkwardly on a corner chair, was a man who introduced himself as Mr. Albie Dray, the estate's gardener and custodian of the conservatory. His hands were scarred and calloused, his boots still flecked with dirt. Holmes took a slow circuit around the room, nodding cordially but saying little. Gregson cleared his throat. As you are all aware, Mr. Sherlock Holmes has been engaged to consult on Lord Wexham's passing. You will answer his questions honestly and without speculation. Holmes gave a dismissive wave. No need for formalities. Inspector, I find people more revealing when they forget their suspects. He took a seat near the hearth, drawing one leg over the other and tapping his fingers lightly on the armrest. I understand Lord Wexham was a man of habit. He kept regular hours. Yes, Imogen replied first. He rose at 7. Breakfast alone. Study from 9 till noon. After that letters. The conservatory, sometimes walks if weather allowed. Did he ever receive visitors? Rarely. He preferred correspondence to the company. Holmes shifted his attention to Blake. Mr. Blake, how recently did you see Lord Wexham? 3 days before his death. I was delivering paperwork, routine estate matters. He seemed distracted, but lucid. Distracted by what? Blake hesitated. He mentioned an unsettling letter, something poetic and vaguely threatening, but he dismissed it as the sort of eccentricity that followed men of his wealth. Holmes, eyes lit. He used that word. Poetic. Yes. He even made a joke, said the author had more talent for drama than murder. Holmes leaned back. Fascinating. And what of you, Mrs. Barley? Did you observe any unusual behavior in the days before his death? The housekeeper's gaze flicked briefly toward Imogen before she answered. His lordship was prone to moods, but yes, more anxious than usual. He forbade the cleaning of the study, claimed things had been moved, had they? Her voice grew tight. Not by any of the staff. Holmes nodded. And Meeks, what of the argument you overheard? You said you heard Lord Wexham speaking to someone? The old butler looked up slowly, as if rousing from a fog. Yes, sir. About 9:30. I was clearing the drawing room when I heard him at the door. He was angry, very, said something like, "You were never meant to see that, and I should have burned it." Then silence. Did you recognize the other voice? Meeks frowned. Hard to say. It could have been young Mr. Blake, or maybe Mr. Dre here. It was soft-sounding. Holmes turned to Dre. The gardener squirmed. Sir, I never spoke to the master that night. I was in the conservatory till late, minding the heaters for the rare insects some of 'em die if the temperature drops. Holmes arched a brow. Did Lord Wexham visit the conservatory that day? Round 6. He seemed agitated. Stood by the Firefly dome for a good while, just staring at it. Muttered something about a promise. Then he left. A promise. Holmes repeated. To whom? I wonder. Dre looked down. Wouldn't know, sir. Holmes rose and paced before the fire, hands clasped behind his back. Each of you is offered a piece of the puzzle. Some pieces fit, some do not. But in all this, I sense one common thread. Lord Wexham feared the past, or rather, something buried in it. He turned to Blake. Mr. Blake, may I trouble you for a list of everyone who stood to gain from Lord Wexham's will? Blake nodded. Miss Wexham, chiefly. A few endowments to the British Museum, and a charitable trust for rare species preservation. But yes, Miss Wexham would inherit the manor and most of his liquid assets. Holmes turned back to Imogen. And do you know if your uncle ever altered his will recently? Her lips pressed into a thin line. He did mention it, but nothing was finalized. Indeed, Holmes said, almost to himself, because finality is a dangerous thing when secrets still roam the corridors. With that, he turned to Gregson. I must speak to Mr. Dorian Kell with urgency, but instruct your men to prevent any departures from the estate and have the conservatory locked. I believe the key to this mystery may yet have wings. And with that cryptic pronouncement, Holmes swept from the room, his coat trailing behind him like the tail of a storm. I followed, notebook in hand, aware that we had glimpsed only shadows and the light that cast them had yet to be found. Chapter 5. First suspects. The red Heringas. We rode back to London in a first-class carriage, the countryside unspooled in a blur of frost-bitten hedgerows and skeletal trees. Holmes was in one of his silent moods. That strange trance where the machinery of his mind clicked away at some invisible gearwork. I had come to recognize these spells as a prelude to some deduction of quiet brilliance, and thus I let him sit, undisturbed, his fingers steepled, eyes half-flitted, as if watching something only he could see. "I do not like Mr. Neville Blake," he said at last. It was not a statement born of passion, but of analysis, cold, clinical, and final. "You believe he's hiding something?" "I am certain of it," Holmes said. There is a subtle tightness to his answers. Every phrase is calculated, not evasive enough to raise suspicion from Gregson, but to polish for my liking, and his motives, financial proximity. Holmes replied. He handled Wexham's accounts, oversaw legal transitions, and likely had knowledge of the will before even Imogen Wexham did. Men in such positions know how to remove fingerprints from paper trails. I jotted notes. Still, his presence during the argument Meeks overheard is unconfirmed. Holmes gave a sharp smile. "But not impossible. What do we know, Watson? A locked room. No visible wound. A firefly's wing. A cryptic death. The broken ceiling wax, placed like a discarded prop on a stage. And in the background a man trained to make paper appear truthful. We arrived in London by early afternoon. The city wreathed in chimney smoke and pale sunlight. A cab delivered us to a bookshop in the Bloomsbury district, tucked between a map dealer and an antiquarian press. Above the narrow door, the sign read, D. Kell, Antiquities, Rare Manuscripts, and Arcana. Inside, the shop smelled of ancient leather and dust, a comforting aroma to a bibliophile, but oppressive in its claustrophobic density. The shelves were packed with oddities, jade figurines, parchment scrolls under glass, and mounted insects preserved in domes of glass like funeral relics. It was a museum of secrets. A man emerged from behind a velvet curtain, tall and angular, with dark hair streaked with silver and a scar running along the left side of his jaw. His fingers were ink-stained, and his eyes narrowed at the sight of U.S. Mr. Holmes, he said, and Dr. Watson, no doubt. "You expected us?" Holmes asked. "Imogen wrote to me. She said you might come." Holmes gave a faint nod. "Then you know we're investigating the death of Lord Wexham. Murder," Kell said quietly. "Let us not play coy. He was killed." Holmes arched a brow. "That's a bold claim, Mr. Kell." "It is not bold if it is inevitable," Kell said. "Julian Wexham made many enemies. I was merely the most vocal among them." "You admit to threatening him?" I asked. Kell offered a grim smile. "I accused him of theft. A sacred statue, purchased from a Burmese monastery under false pretenses, when I protested. He silenced me with lawyers, so yes, I threatened to expose him, but not to kill him." Holmes strolled toward a case containing a preserved butterfly, its wings iridescent in the dim light. "And what of fireflies, Mr. Kell? Do you keep any in your collection?" Kell looked surprised. "No. Wexham had a fascination with them. He believed they held mystical symbolism. I found it childish." "But you were familiar with his collection?" Kell hesitated. "We were rivals, Mr. Holmes. I knew his tastes, his habits, his obsessions. He believed that preserving things, people, places, memories was the only way to fight decay. He didn't collect for beauty. He collected to control time." Holmes nodded slowly. "And do you know of a phrase, 'The fire will find the amber heart'?" Kell stiffened, his mouth tightening. "That was written in a monograph, One Eye, published 20 years ago, on the folklore of the Han peoples. It referred to a ritual involving trapped souls in resin. Then the note Miss Wexham received, I murmured, was quoting me," Kell said, "but I never sent it." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then turned to me. "Watson, observe the paradox. A man whose words are used in a death he did not cause, and yet he admits enmity. It is possible, likely even, that Mr. Kell is our red herring." Kell looked confused, You think I'm innocent. Then, I think you are not the killer. But I also think you're not telling us everything. Kel sighed and walked to a desk, withdrawing a small folder. This arrived 2 days ago. No return address. I was too cautious to bring it forward until I knew what it meant. He handed it to Holmes. Inside was a single photograph, a close-up of Lord Wexham's amber Firefly, unmistakable. Pinned beside it was a clipping from Kel's own monograph. The passage circled in red ink. When the fire reaches the amber heart, the soul is released through smoke and light. Beneath it, a handwritten line, one collector down. Holmes' face darkened. You see, Mr. Holmes, Kel said quietly, I believe I was meant to be next. Holmes turned to him. You must remain in London under watch. You are not the killer, but you are now a piece on the board and someone is moving them very deliberately. As we left the shop, Holmes said nothing for a full minute, his breath curling into the winter air like dragon smoke. Then he spoke, slowly and with certainty. This is not about money, Watson, nor inheritance. It is about possession and punishment, about a past that was sealed and is now cracking open. We rode back toward Baker Street in silence. I could feel that some trap, sprung long ago, had begun to tighten, and someone in Wexham, manner quiet, patient, cunning, was waiting to strike again. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A hidden inconsistency. That night, as the gas lamps hissed quietly against the frost outside, and the fire in our Baker Street hearth burned low, Holmes sat, unmoving in his armchair. The remnants of supper lay untouched beside him. His fingers drummed in a slow, measured rhythm against the carved wood of the armrest, and his gaze was fixed not on any object in the room, but on some invisible pattern in his mind. We had returned from Kel's shop hours ago. I had gone over my notes thrice already, cross-referencing testimonies, inconsistencies, and symbols. But Holmes was calculating. There's a line, Watson, he said suddenly, a thin one like silk, drawn through fog that runs from the Wexham estate to Kel's bookshop. But the thread frays halfway through. Something is deliberately inconsistent. Inconsistent how? I asked, setting down my pen. He stood, walked to his desk, and spread out the photographs and notes like a cartographer laying maps before an expedition. Observe, he said, pointing to a photograph of the sealed letter Imogen Wexham had received. It quotes a specific passage from Kel's old monograph, word for word. Yes, yet Kel claims he hasn't opened that monograph in years. He only realized the source when I quoted the phrase to him. Perhaps he forgot the wording? Holmes shook his head. No, Watson, the wording in the letter is not the version published in the original monograph. He pulled out an old, foxed copy of Folklore of the Forgotten Hun, procured during our earlier visit. Though I had not seen him take it, read the line aloud, he commanded, tapping the original passage. I cleared my throat. When fire meets amber, the spirit is unshackled by smoke and light. Holmes lifted the letter Imogen had received. When the fire reaches the amber heart, the soul is released through smoke and light. I blinked. Not the same, not even close. Same intent, different structure. One is Kel's printed line, the other has been paraphrased deliberately. Whoever sent that note was quoting not from the monograph, but from memory or, more likely, from conversation. So the killer may have spoken with Kel, or with someone who has, Holmes said. And there are very few people in England who converse with Kel about Han death rituals and arcane symbolism. Miss Wexham, perhaps, possibly Neville, Blake, and he paused, brow furrowed. There was someone else, he muttered, someone who he froze. Then he spun around and rifled through the notes he had taken at Wexham Manor. From beneath the folder marked staff statements, he withdrew a slip of paper, yellow with age. Aha, what is it? I asked. Holmes passed it to me. It was a catalog listing from the Manor's own archival room. Item number 42, annotated notes on Han funerary traditions, transcribed from oral discussions with Decal, kept for cross-reference with insect preservation collection. I stared. Are you suggesting Lord Wexham kept Kell's spoken insights in his own collection? Without Kell's permission? Holmes nodded. That's why Kell was livid. Wexham didn't just collect objects, he collected ideas. That phrase may have originated from Kell's speech, but the version in the letter to Miss Wexham was likely Wexham's personal paraphrasing. Then the killer had access to Wexham's private papers. Precisely, Holmes said. And not just access, they had studied them. They wanted Imogen to believe her father's death was fated, a mystical inevitability, and they borrowed Wexham's own stolen interpretation to do so. I looked up. This was a theatrical act, entirely. Holmes replied, a firefly's wing, a sealed window, a handwritten quote from an obscure death rite. It's not a killer trying to hide. It's a killer trying to teach. He crossed to the fireplace, gazing into the flames. And that brings us to our next inconsistency, Watson. I followed him. Go on. Holmes pulled a pair of small tweezers from his drawer and held up a second firefly wing retrieved from the rug beside Wexham's desk, now sealed between the glass slides. Lord Wexham's collection did contain fireflies, yes, but they were framed, mounted, and pressed beneath resin, sealed behind glass with near surgical precision. He gestured to the slide. This wing was not carefully preserved. It was torn ragged at the edge. I frowned. So not taken from the display, exactly. Which raises the question, where did it come from? I felt a chill creep along my spine. You're saying the wing was fresh, not fresh, newly disturbed. Someone retrieved it from another specimen, one not on display, which means the killer has access to specimens that we have not seen, hidden at Wexham Manor. Holmes nodded. Possibly, or somewhere the killer alone can access, somewhere private. This was not a moment of improvisation. It was curated. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson knocked softly and brought in a telegram. Holmes opened it immediately, eyes scanning its contents. From Gregson, he murmured. He's discovered something. I stood. The autopsy. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Better. Wexham's missing correspondence. We arrived at Scotland Yard just past midnight. Gregson was in his office, his tie loose and his eyes red-rimmed from fatigue. He pushed a folder across the table. Found this under a false panel in Wexham's writing desk, he said. One of my constables knocked it loose by accident. Holmes opened the folder. Inside were several unsent letters, one marked for legal counsel, another for a museum curator, and the third addressed to Miss Imogen Wexham. Holmes read it aloud. My dearest Imogen, there are matters I have long shielded you from, perhaps foolishly. I fear some of my acquisitions were not entirely legal. Voices are whispering now, not from without, but from within the house, the winged things in the dark. I sense they are coming. I have begun sealing the windows at night, not for warmth, but for silence. If anything should happen to me, go to Cal. He knows where the line was crossed. Your loving father, Julian. Gregson scratched his beard. You believe he was going mad? Holmes's voice was soft. No, I believe he was being watched, and he knew it. I stared at the letter. The windows. He sealed them himself, or so it appears, but the killer used it, left them sealed to create the illusion of a locked room. Holmes looked up, eyes sharp, which means our culprit is not only clever, they're intimate with the layout habits and secrets of Wexham's inner world. Gregson grimaced. Then your suspect list just shrank, didn't it? Holmes tapped the letter once, then stood. Yes, and tomorrow I shall test that intimacy. As we returned to Baker Street through the silent, gaslight streets, I could feel it again, that tightening coil, that quiet breath before the spring of a trap. Holmes said nothing more until we reached the foot of our stairs. Then he turned and said, almost gently, "Watson, when we return to Wexham Manor, we shall find a door that was never meant to be opened, and behind it a truth buried, beneath wings and amber." Chapter 7. Return to Wexham. Secrets. In the stud-eyed sky over Surrey was leaden with cloud. When we arrived once more at Wexham Manor, the house loomed darkly through the mist, its windows shuttered, its gates still guarded by the quiet grief that hung over its halls. It was just past noon, though you would not have known it. The fog clung so thickly to the hedges and turrets that even the birds seemed unwilling to fly. Holmes had spoken little during our journey. He occupied himself with a folded map of the manor grounds and a list of the estate's staff, drawn from Gregson's files. His right hand traced and retraced one particular corridor on the blueprint, a narrow annex that led off from the late Lord Wexham's private study. We were greeted by Mr. Hartley, the estate manager, whose calm had grown brittle since our first encounter. "Miss Wexham is in the drawing room," he murmured. "She asks for a moment alone. She's been reading her father's recovered letter. It's shaken her." Holmes nodded once. "No need to disturb her just yet. Dr. Watson and I shall begin in the study." Hartley hesitated. "You'll find it exactly as you left it, Mr. Holmes. We've not touched a thing." "I'd be surprised if you had," Holmes replied, and with that we proceeded to the scene of the crime. The study, even in daylight, was a chamber of shadows. The air was dry and still, as though the fire that had once crackled there had taken the warmth with it when it died. Holmes moved immediately to the desk, brushing away the thin layer of settled dust on the wood with a gloved hand. "There," he murmured, pointing to the edge. "You see, Watson, scratches." I leaned closer. Tiny grooves, parallel and uneven, etched into the wood just beneath the brass lamp. "Could be anything, but they are not," he said. "They are too regular to be incidental, too recent to be forgotten." Holmes reached into his coat and retrieved a thin steel probe and a magnifying lens. He ran his fingers along the underside of the desk's surface, pausing halfway beneath the drawer. "Aha!" He pressed upward, and with a soft click, a narrow panel along the back wall of the study, a section that had appeared part of the mahogany bookcase, swung slightly ajar. We both stared at it. "A concealed passage?" I asked. "No," Holmes said quietly. "A storage alcove." He pushed it fully open. Inside was a cramped recess, no more than a few feet deep. Dust choked the air as we leaned in. Coughing, within lay a wooden chest, bound in aged leather, its latch sealed with a wax imprint bearing the Wexham crest. Holmes broke the seal with his gloved thumb and opened the lid. Inside were 3 glass specimen jars, sealed tight, each containing the curled remains of insects, not just fireflies, but centipedes, spiders, even something resembling a hornet the size of a man's thumb. Beneath the jars lay several brittle manuscripts and a set of correspondences, some in Wexham's handwriting, others unsigned. Holmes rifled carefully through the letters. I stood over his shoulder, reading as he did. "You are right. The amber specimens emit no phosphorescence until exposed to prolonged warmth. It is as you said, the glow is residual, like memory. The rituals may be superstition, but I have seen something in the shadows of the resin that stares back. We must keep this between us. The museum knows nothing." "Jekyll," I muttered. "He was involved." Holmes nodded, face drawn tight. "But not recently. These letters are old, 2 years, perhaps more. And note the tone. Wexham speaks not of betrayal, but of secrecy. These were academic co-conspirators, not enemies." He paused, setting aside a final envelope. Inside it was a faded sketch, drawn in ink, of a strange circular chamber, walls carved with glyphs and a central pedestal bearing a jar. Below, Wexham had written, Pattern observed in ruins near Jan hypothesized symbolic of spirit containment. Light equals release. I stared at the drawing. Do you believe he truly thought he was holding spirits in amber? I believe. Holmes said. He believed he was on the edge of rediscovery. That's the danger of men like Wexham. They convince themselves their thefts are justified in the pursuit of wonder. He returned the papers to the chest, leaving one jar out. It contained a firefly, but not like any I had seen before. Its wings were larger, tinted orange along the veins, and the body had a faint luminescent shimmer even in death. This, Holmes said, is not native to Europe. What does that mean? It means someone went to great trouble to source a specimen that would never raise suspicion, because Wexham already had it hidden here. I was about to respond when we heard footsteps at the door. Imogen Wexham entered, still pale, her eyes rimmed red. I thought I heard voices, she said softly. Holmes turned to her, gentle but firm. Miss Wexham, I must ask you a direct question. Were you aware of this alcove in your father's study? Her eyes widened at the open panel. No, I had no idea. That space it wasn't on any floor plan, and yet your father kept his. Most sensitive materials here, Holmes said. Letters, insects, even unregistered acquisitions. She moved closer, her fingers trembling as she took in the jar he held. That's not one of the framed ones. I've never seen it. Holmes nodded. It was used. A wing from one of these was left near your father's body. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a message. Imogen's voice faltered. From whom? That, Holmes said. We are about to determine. He reached into the chest again and retrieved a small linen pouch tucked behind the jars. Inside was a ring, plain gold, but etched with a sigil I recognized immediately. That's Neville Blake's family crest. I said. Imogen gasped. Neville. But why would? Holmes held up his hand. We do not accuse yet, but it raises an urgent question. Mr. Blake visited your father not long before his death. Yes, she said. He said he came to apologize for his father's behavior. And during that visit, Holmes said he had access to this study. Imogen nodded slowly, realization dawning behind her expression. You think he found this? I think, Holmes said. He knew where to look. A silence settled, broken only by the wind clawing softly at the window panes. Then Holmes straightened. Watson, he said briskly, we leave at once. Where to? To question Mr. Neville Blake. But not at his home. No, there is another place, a private gallery in the city that deals in unverified antiquities. If Blake was seeking access to this kind of specimen, he didn't come to Wexham to apologize. He turned to Imogen. Your father feared someone had learned too much. He was right. And I believe the final act of this crime was not about greed, nor even vengeance, but about knowledge that should have remained buried. Chapter 8. The gallery behind the red curtain. The time we reached London, the clouds had parted, but a different kind of haze hung in the air, one of tension, secrecy, and unease. Holmes, ever a man of momentum, had wasted no time arranging our visit. The Lucent Curio, he had said cryptically on the train, a place that exists in whispers and ledgers, but never in advertisements. I had heard of it in passing, from colleagues and former soldiers with a taste for the exotic. It was an establishment known to those who traded in rare relics, ancient charms, and objects too peculiar or too cursed for public display. Legally ambiguous and deliberately discreet. We found it tucked behind a row of dilapidated tenements near Clerkenwell, a converted theater. Its front doors painted a faded red and its name absent, save for a brass dragon-shaped knocker. Holmes rapped 3 times, then twice more in quick succession. A narrow slot opened in the door. A pair of eyes assessed us with reptilian detachment. We seek the keeper, Holmes said coolly. Under the terms of the Falstaff exchange, there was a pause. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and the scent of Old paper. A low corridor opened into a vast room, its walls lined with cabinets and velvet curtains concealing what lay within. Artifacts of every description rested on glass pedestals, jade figurines, obsidian masks, ivory combs, and preserved insects mounted in crystalline domes. A man stood near the back, tall and impossibly thin, draped in a long plum-colored robe. His skin was pale as parchment, and a pince-nez rested precariously on his aquiline nose. He gave us the barest nod as we approached. "You are the keeper?" Holmes asked. "I am," came the soft, rustling reply. "And you, Mr. Holmes, are late." "I come on business rather than courtesy," Holmes said. "I seek information on a man who visited you recently, a Mr. Neville Blake." The keeper's expression didn't change, though his fingers twitched faintly at his sides. "Many men pass through here. Names are not given, but artifacts are traded," Holmes pressed, "and I suspect Mr. Blake was interested in something luminous." There was a beat of silence. Then the keeper gestured with two fingers and turned, gliding toward a side chamber. "This way." We followed him down a narrow aisle between rows of locked cabinets until we reached a small antechamber lit by a single stained glass lantern. Upon a lacquered table lay a ledger and, beside it, a specimen jar nearly identical to those we had found at Wexham Manor. Inside it was a firefly, but its wings were broken, and its thorax bore a fine incision, as though it had been studied, then hastily returned. The insect's glow was long extinguished, but a faint trace of phosphorescent dust clung to the interior of the glass. "This was brought to me by Mr. Blake," the keeper said, 2 weeks ago. He offered it not for sale, but for verification. He believed it to be of supernatural origin." "And what did you tell him?" Holmes asked. The keeper smiled faintly. "That the world is full of mysteries, but if he sought enlightenment, he would find more use in Wexham's journals than in trinkets." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You directed him back to Wexham?" "I did not need to," the keeper said calmly. "He had already gone. He wanted the key to something older than theft or science. He was obsessed with a ritual he found referenced in a manuscript, Wexham's private notes, I presume. Something about releasing the flame within." I shifted uneasily. "Did he mention harming Lord Wexham?" "No," the keeper said. "But he was agitated, desperate. He left that jar in my possession in exchange for access to a restricted section of the archive." Holmes stepped forward. "Which section?" The keeper hesitated, then turned and reached into a drawer behind him. He produced a small portfolio, bound in green silk. Inside were several sketches and notes written in a hurried hand. "Copies," he explained, "of what Mr. Blake studied. I make duplicates of all such interactions. Insurance, you might say." Holmes spread the papers on the table. I leaned in, my eyes caught by the same diagram we'd seen in Wexham's letter, a circular room, glyphs carved in arcs, and at the center, a pedestal bearing a glowing jar. "What does this mean?" I asked. "It's a ritual chamber," Holmes murmured, "or a tomb, or both. The language here is ancient Chinese, possibly a mix of Pekin dialects." He traced a line of symbols with his gloved hand. "Light the vessel. Burn the breath of the imprisoned. The soul within shall echo its last." Watson shuddered. "You think Blake tried to replicate this? That he believed the amber insects contained spirits?" Holmes did not answer directly. "He believed they had a voice, that much is clear. And Wexham's notes may have convinced him there was more truth in myth than he'd ever allowed himself to believe." Holmes stood, returning the portfolio. "One last question. Do you know where Blake went after he left?" The keeper hesitated again, then answered, "Only that he spoke of returning to a place where fire first showed him the truth." I assumed it was metaphorical. Holmes's face grew still. "It was not. We left the curio in silence, outside." The mist had returned to the streets. curling around gas lamps and stone like a veil. What did he mean? I asked Holmes as we walked briskly toward a waiting cab. Blake is returning to the origin point, Holmes said. Not where Wexham died, but where his obsession began. You mean the site where the original Firefly was found? Precisely, Holmes said. There was only one location Wexham recorded as the initial source to amber relic chamber unearthed. During his expedition near Lake Mörk in Sweden, he never publicized the location. But I've pieced it together from his maps and travelogues, and Blake must have found it too. But that's hundreds of miles away. Indeed, Holmes said, climbing into the cab. And if we do not stop him, he may open something better left sealed. I stared at him. You think he means to perform the ritual? Holmes's eyes met mine. I think Blake has gone mad chasing ghosts in glass. Chapter 9. Crossing the ice to Lake Mörk. 3 days later, we stood beneath a slate-gray sky. The vastness of Lake Mörk stretching out before us like a frozen mirror. Wind howled across the surface, scattering powdery snow in low, spiraling eddies. The cold was bone-deep, the kind that made teeth ache and breath come in fogged gasps. Holmes stood at the lake's edge, a folded map in one hand, his scarf fluttering like a pennant in the Arctic wind. The chamber lies near the far shore, he murmured, pointing to a mark inked in red, just beyond that ridge of pine. If Blake's gone ahead, and I believe he has, we'll find his trail there. I adjusted the strap of my rucksack and stared across the wine-blasted lake. He wouldn't have tried to cross this on foot, would he? On foot or by sledge. The surface is solid, 2 feet thick, by the locals' report. He would have had little choice. No roads lead that far inland. We began our trek cautiously, our boots crunching over hardened ice as we made our way across the great frozen expanse. Behind us, the small village of Norholt dwindled into the white haze, a mere cluster of chimneys and peaked rooftops. We had arrived by train from Stockholm, then hired a sleigh to bring us as far as the forest's edge. From there, it was up to us. Holmes walked with a grim efficiency, his gaze never still. I followed in his tracks, the cold numbing my fingers. Despite 2 layers of gloves, hours passed with only the whistling wind for company. The sun, barely skimming the horizon, cast long purple shadows over the snow. I began to lose sense of time, of distance. All was endless white. Then Holmes stopped. Do you smell that? He said suddenly. I inhaled deeply. Beneath the sharpness of ice and pine, something acrid lingered in the air-burned wood, perhaps, or oil. We quickened our pace, cresting a ridge of wine-shaped snow. Beyond it, nestled among black pines, stood a makeshift camp to canvas tents partially collapsed, and the scorched remains of a campfire. Nearby, snowshoes and discarded crates suggested recent human activity. Holmes knelt near the fire, brushing away a layer of frost, still warm beneath. He noted, Blake passed through here not 12 hours ago. And the second tent? I asked. Eyeing the smaller of the 2, Holmes lifted the flap carefully. Inside lay journals, a battered field lamp, and something that made my breath catch, a glass jar, its lid sealed tightly. Within, another Firefly, this one intact, still glowing faintly in the dimness. Its light flickered softly, like the last ember of a dying hearth. This cannot be natural, I whispered. Holmes didn't answer. He examined the jar in silence, then retrieved a folded parchment from the journals. The pages were covered in dense writing. Blake's hand, undoubtedly. The top bore a title, Reanimation Through Luminous Ether, Ritual of the Third Flame. Holmes read aloud, voice hushed but even. To open the vessel, one must surround it with the breath of its birth, the pine, the resin, the powdered root of the Genghis orchid. Heat must be applied from below while chant is maintained in the old Tungsi glyph. Appendices. He looked up at me. Wexham didn't just collect these insects. He believed they were part of a greater mechanism, a spiritual engine of sorts. Blake thinks he can complete it. I exhaled slowly. And you believe he's gone to the chamber to try? He has everything he needs, Holmes replied grimly. A secluded location, the original site. And now the instructions. We packed what we could from the camp and pressed onward, deeper into the woods. As we climbed a narrow pass toward the northeastern edge of the lake, the air grew strangely still. Trees closed in around us, gnarled and bare, their blackened limbs clawing at the gray sky. The snow here was disturbed bootprints, drag marks, scattered ashes. A trail dot, then the woods ended. Before us stood the ruins of an ancient structure, low stone walls half buried in snow. And at their center, a circular stair descending into darkness. The chamber, the same one Blake had sketched in his notes. My skin prickled as I peered down the steps. Faint light flickered below, orange and green, like a candle burning inside a prison. Holmes turned to me. Whatever happens in there, keep your wits about you. If he's begun the ritual, we may already be too late. We descended. The air within was stifling, warm with a strange herbal tang. The passage opened into a round chamber with a domed ceiling carved in spirals. Glyphs lined the walls, swirling characters, older than language. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and on it, a large amber jar. Beside it knelt Blake. He did not turn as we entered. His coat lay discarded, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. Round him, chalk runes marked the floor. Nearby, a brazier smoldered with blue smoke. I was expecting you, Blake said softly. Holmes. Watson, step away from the pedestal. Holmes said evenly. You don't know what you're doing. But I do, Blake replied, finally turning. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale, but his expression bore the rapture of a prophet. This fire, it sings. Wexham heard it too, but he feared it. You killed Wexham, I said coldly. Blake flinched, then nodded once. He tried to destroy the jar, said it should never be opened. But I knew better. I heard the voice in my sleep. He turned back to the jar, raising a flask of golden liquid. 3 drops of the sap, 1 word from the glyph. That's all, Blake, Holmes said. Stepping forward, you believe this will grant you power. But you've misread the ritual. The glyphs do not say release, they say consume. Blake hesitated. That's a lie. It is not. You'll burn from the inside out. Holmes said, voice low. You're not summoning a spirit. You're offering yourself as fuel. Blake's hand trembled. Then he looked at the firefly within the jar. Its glow had brightened. Then let it burn, he whispered and uncorked the flask. Holmes lunged up. The flask shattered. There was a flash green fire erupting from the pedestal. The glyphs blazed like molten iron. I grabbed Holmes's coat, dragging him backward as Blake screamed. The light enveloped him and then silence. Just the sound of crackling embers and the faint whisper of wind from above. We stared at the pedestal. The jar was blackened, the firefly inside gone. Blake's body lay collapsed on the chamber floor, untouched by flame, but utterly lifeless. Holmes stood slowly, brushing ash from his coat. A man consumed by the fire he worshipped. I nodded, grimly. And the fire, extinguished. Holmes looked to the jar. Its glow did not return. For now. Chapter 10. Ashes beneath the snow. Wind had risen to a shriek. By the time we emerged from the chamber, leaving the unnatural warmth of the underground vault for the sterile, biting cold above, Holmes, as ever, was silent. His eyes, though, were not still. They moved with restless calculation, as though they remained fixed not on the present, but on some deeper sequence of the past, on symbols unspoken, on words never uttered. I had seen him this way before, after a case in which the body had been claimed, but not the truth. We carried Blake's remains across the ridge and back to the frozen camp beneath the trees. There we laid him under the tarp of one collapsed tent. No rites, No words, only the long, unbroken quiet of snow falling upon canvas. Blake had danced it close to the sun, and the flames had taken more than just flesh later. Seated by the revived fire with steaming mugs of coffee in hand, I tried to put the pieces in order. He believed the ritual would release something, I said, watching Holmes as he stared at the amber jar, now cracked, its glow extinguished. But it didn't, did it? No, Holmes said without looking up, because it was never meant to be released. It was meant to contain. He finally turned to me, eyes grave. Wexham didn't collect the fireflies out of curiosity. He trapped them, imprisoned them, in glass and amber, each one a ward, a seal, I asked, my voice catching with unease. Sealing what? Holmes tapped the side of the jar. Not what? Whom? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He wasn't summoning a spirit, Holmes said. He was feeding one, slowly, bit by bit. Each firefly a fragment of something larger, more ancient. A soul, I said softly, or the memory of one, Holmes replied. Something so old it couldn't exist in the physical world all at once. So it was broken, dispersed, locked away, and Blake was the final key. He didn't know it, but his obsession, his drive, they were all guided, perhaps even implanted. A man convinced he'd found forbidden knowledge when all along he was simply following a path laid out for him. I stared into the fire, letting its light dance behind my eyes. The wind tore through the trees like a scream. Holmes unfolded Blake's parchment again. The ritual, the glyphs, the notations in the margins, they spoke of stages. 3, in fact. Blake had completed the second, but the third, that section, had been torn away. There were only traces of ink, half-formed sentences at the edge. If Blake didn't finish it, I said, then who will? Holmes looked away, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Someone who already has. I blinked. What do you mean? Holmes reached into his coat and drew out the first firefly jar, the one we'd retrieved from Wexham's study in London. But now, it too was dark. The glow had faded completely. It didn't die. Holmes said, rotating the jar. It was taken, drawn out, absorbed by the entity Blake tried to awaken. Holmes gave a short nod, and the energy released in the ritual, that rush of light and heat, it was siphoned, sent elsewhere. Where? He didn't answer, but his gaze fell on the horizon, toward the western tree line, back toward civilization. That night, as we camped near the edge of the lake, I awoke just after midnight to find Holmes standing. Watch, the fire's glow painting harsh shadows across his face. He had the amber jar in his hand again, studying it, listening. There's something I haven't told you, Watson, he said, voice low. Something I've only recently recalled. I sat up slowly, blinking the sleep from my eyes years ago. He continued, I consulted on a case in Constantinople long before I met you. A series of disappearances in the city's underground cisterns. The victims were all scholars, linguists, people versed in ancient alphabets. He knelt beside the fire and added his stick, sparks leaping up like startled birds. They'd all been corresponding with a man called Drell, supposedly a priest, but no records of such a person existed. Drell spoke of a returning god, one whose name had been carved in flame before the first city was founded. The letters he sent bore symbols almost identical to these. He held up Blake's parchment again, his fingers tracing the glyphs. I didn't realize the connection until I saw them in Wexham's notes. You think this, Drell, if he exists. He's trying again. Holmes gave me a grim smile. I think he never stopped. The next morning, we returned to Norholt and sent word to Inspector Lestrade, along with a parcel containing Blake's journals and the 2 extinguished jars. From there, we traveled south by rail, but our path was no longer linear. Holmes had changed. There was a tightness about him now, a quiet urgency. We stopped in Göteborg only long enough for Holmes to pore over a map of Northern Europe, cross-referencing coordinates from Blake's annotations with archaic trade routes and vanished monastic orders. "There's a monastery," he finally said, "or rather, the remains of one, near the Norwegian border. The last known site mentioned in Wexham's records the locals call it the Chapel of Embers. And you believe that's where the third stage begins. I believe it already has." As we boarded the train westward, I found myself reflecting not just on the growing danger, but on Holmes himself. He had always walked the edge brilliant, unshakable, unyielding. But this case had reached something deeper, a truth older than logic, a flame that flickered behind the eyes of men who believed deeply in what could not be explained. Holmes had never feared the unknown, but now I was no longer sure the unknown feared him. Chapter 11. The Chapel of Embers. Journey toward the Norwegian frontier grew darker with every mile, both in light and in tone. The snow was thicker now, heavier somehow, as if the very air were growing dense with time. Holmes was reticent as we traveled, more than usual. He pored over every scrap of Blake's fragmented notes, every weathered page of Wexham's journal, cross-checking strange coordinates, monastic seals, and translations of dead dialects. His deductions, though silent, stirred behind his eyes like a storm beneath ice. It was near dusk when the carriage left us at the foot of an unmarked slope. Cloaked in ash-colored pine and silence, the driver, an old man with shaking hands, refused to go any further. He muttered a name before turning the Horse's Den DCD's Kirk, the Church of the Dead. Holmes and I proceeded on foot, boots crunching over a path long forgotten. Moss curled over fallen stones. Broken beams of once-carved archways lay buried beneath snowdrifts. And there, upon a lonely rise half swallowed by earth, stood the ruin of the chapel, a broken skeleton of slate and bone. Its walls leaned inward, as if imploding from secrets too heavy to bear. Through shattered arches, we could see the remnants of pews and a pulpit turned to dust. But at the far end, half buried beneath a collapsed arch, stood something that had not crumbled, a door, framed in blackened iron, untouched by time. Holmes approached with a solemn precision. "Wexham came here," he said, brushing his fingers over a rusted bolt, "or someone like him. The geometry, this is not medieval design. It's older. Etruscan, perhaps, or earlier." I examined the stonework. The carvings were faint but deliberate, interlocking fireflies, their wings stylized into flames, their bodies arranged in a spiral that led into the earth. With effort, Holmes pried the door open. The air that greeted us was warm. I nearly stepped back. It was impossible. The wind outside howled with winter. And yet from this underground corridor came a breath of heat, moist and heavy, like the inside of a crypt sealed for centuries. Torchlight revealed a staircase that descended not in stone, but in smoothed amber. Each step glistened. Beneath the resin shimmered shadows, shapes fossilized in time. Moths, beetles, human fingers. Holmes moved quickly, with the urgency of a man racing the last grains of sand. In a glass, at the bottom lay a domed chamber, impossibly wide, hollowed into the bedrock. And there, rising from its center like an altar, was a slab of obsidian ringed in rusted chains. Above it floated a single jar, not resting. Floating. Its glow was steady, pulsing, as if breathing. "I had feared," Holmes murmured, "but I did not know." He turned to me. "This is not just a seal, it is the heart." He pointed toward the ring of chains. They were not meant to hold it physically but spiritually. Symbols etched into the rust, Nordic runes, mixed with Sanskrit and early Mesopotamian glyphs. It took entire civilizations to contain this thing. I stepped forward, the weight of it pressing on my chest. And now, Holmes looked at the glowing jar. "Now it is waking." He stepped closer to the altar, studying the chainwork, the cracks in the surrounding floor. A fissure had split one of the anchor points, leaking warmth like blood from a vein. Blake's ritual was incomplete, Holmes said, but someone else has continued it. He gestured to a corner of the chamber, new footprints in the amber dust. Someone had been here. Recently, they're preparing the third stage, Holmes whispered. The final binding or the final release. I moved to his side. Then, we stopped them. Yes, Holmes said, withdrawing his revolver, or die trying. Chapter 12, echoes in the recent silence inside the amber chamber was a suffocating thing. Thick and expectant, as though it listened. Holmes and I stood unmoving, the pulsing light of the floating jar reflecting in his sharp eyes and dancing across the cavern's golden surfaces. That unnatural warmth persisted, seeping into our skin, our bones. The air shimmered, and with each passing moment, I felt an almost imperceptible vibration, a hum low to hear, but felt in the teeth and spine. Holmes knelt beside the obsidian slab, brushing away dust from a segment of chain. He examined it closely, then murmured, "See here, this rune has been scored recently, etched by an iron blade. No older than a few days. Someone sought to unbind the protective glyph." He looked up at me grimly. "But why stop here?" Before I could answer, a sound broke the silence, a soft click footsteps. We turned as one. Holmes lifting his revolver. From the far end of the chamber, just beyond the curvature of the wall, emerged a figure wrapped in furs and shadows. A pale face gleamed beneath a hood, eyes wide, and burning with something that was not entirely sanity, that it was Peter Wexam. He froze at the sight of Holmes, as if confronted by a phantom. Then, suddenly, his lips curled into a strange, relieved smile. "You came," he said softly, voice hoarse with disuse. "You followed the map." Holmes stepped forward, revolver steady. "Mr. Wexam, I presume we've come a long way." Wexam blinked, almost dreamily. "I didn't think anyone would solve it. The puzzle was complex. Layers upon layers." He gestured toward the jar. "But it was necessary. It wants to be found." Holmes's voice was low and firm. "What is it?" "The first ember," Wexam said, his tone reverent. "Older than flame, older than words. It is a memory of light. Trapped, angry, alive." Holmes nodded slowly. "And what do you hope to achieve, waking such a thing?" Wexam's smile widened. "Correction, Mr. Holmes, I'm not waking it. I'm freeing it." He raised his hand. For a moment, I thought he might reach for a weapon, but instead, he pulled a silver pendant from beneath his collar, shaped like the spiral of fireflies we'd seen carved in the chapel. As the pendant caught the jar's light, the resonance in the chamber deepened. Holmes stiffened. "He's triggering the collapse. Watson, get back." But Wexam had already moved. With alarming speed, he stepped behind the obsidian altar and drove the pendant downward into the amber floor. The effect was immediate. A crack split outward like a lightning bolt. The humming became a droning roar. Heat surged through the air, and the jar pulsed with wild, frantic light. Inside it, something flickered, shifting, writhing. Holmes fired a single shot, striking the pendant from Wexam's grasp. Sparks exploded. Where it hit, Wexam cried out and stumbled, falling hard onto the fractured amber. I ran forward, seizing his arm and dragging him clear as Holmes reached the pedestal. The jar trembled. A single fracture webbed across its surface. Holmes placed both hands on it. "No," I shouted. "Holmes, don't." But his eyes were closed, face taut with concentration. His voice emerged in a whisper, intoning in languages I barely recognized, half Sanskrit, half ancient Norse fragments we had seen in Wexam's notes, in Blake's cipher, now flowing. In sequence, light burst outward from the jar in a sudden ring, throwing us all backward. When I regained my vision, Holmes was on his knees, gasping for air. The jar hovered, still intact. The glow had dimmed. Wexham lay unconscious beside me, blood trickling from his temple. His hand still reached out, twitching toward the altar. Holmes finally stood, shaking. "It's not over," he rasped. I held it for a moment, but the chains are failing. Whoever tampered with the glyphs left the barrier vulnerable, and now it knows. I helped him up. "What must we do?" Holmes looked toward a sealed archway at the chamber's far end. "We find the original chamber, the true heart. This was merely the gate." As he turned, the jar gave one final flicker, and within it, for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something staring back. Chapter 13. The vault beneath. Winter's breath pressed onward, deeper into the frost-hardened belly of the mountain. Holmes led the way with Wexham's cracked pendant now hanging from his fingers, swinging like a pendulum. The archway that had previously been sealed now yawned open, as if some ancient presence had finally chosen to grant us passage. Wexham, now conscious but bound and groaning, stumbled behind me. His eyes haunted, frenzied, never left the pendant. "It wants light," he muttered again and again. "It dreams of fire." We descended a stairwell carved in perfect concentric circles, each step narrower, colder. The walls were covered in more of the strange resin, but here it pulsed faintly with a breath-like rhythm alive. Holmes barely looked at it, his attention fixed forward, gaze sharpening with every turn. "Wexham's mind is damaged," he said to me quietly, "but not broken. He's seen something, glimpsed a design so vast and old it's corroded reason." "And yet you believe we're following his trail?" I asked. "Not his trail," Holmes replied. "Its trail." He pointed to the patterns on the floor. What I'd first taken as cracks were in fact purposeful markings etched into the stone. Itself glyphs, repeating in spirals. At the center of each, the Firefly symbol. Suddenly, the stairwell widened into a dome. We stepped into the heart of the vault. It was vast, far larger than it should have been by the mountain's outer dimensions. An impossible sphere, hollowed from the mountain's core, and suspended at its center was a structure that defied explanation. Like a chrysalis of fused amber and obsidian, wrapped in vines of silver and threads of molten gold, it pulsed, beating like a slowed heart, and circling it, dozens, no, hundreds of moths. Not fireflies, moths, their wings covered in black ash. They clung to the structure in a trance. "Dear God," I whispered. Holmes didn't reply. His hand moved to his notebook, flipping through pages of copied runes and diagrams. This is the vessel, not a cage, a conduit. It was meant to conduct something." He turned sharply. "Wexham, what were you trying to awaken?" Wexham, his face bathed in the vault's golden glow, merely chuckled. "Not awaken, feed." The air dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Holmes tensed. "Explain." Wexham tilted his head. "It's always hungry. It forgets itself unless it feeds. Memory is its food. That's why it chose me." Holmes looked at the structure with sudden urgency. "The disappearances, the madness, it feeds on thought, on recollection. That's why the journals faded, why Blake tore his eyes out, and why Wexham vanished," I added, the horror dawning fully. "He didn't run. He was taken." Holmes nodded slowly, but not completely consumed. "It needed a vessel to spread, someone to decode the paths, reopen the gate, bring others in." He turned to the chrysalis, "And now it's ready." The moths stirred. A tremor moved through the dome. From the chrysalis, thin cracks of light emerged like the first rays of sun breaking through ash. Holmes moved swiftly, unslinging the leather pouch from his coat. From within, he drew two small clay cylinders, explosives prepared earlier, just in case. "We seal it again," he said. "But how?" I asked. "It's not a thing we can kill." "No," Holmes said, eyes narrowing, "but we can make it. Forget, if it feeds on memory, We can deny it memory, close the path, end the line of thought. He drew a vial from his vest. Wexham's ink, the one that vanished when exposed to heat. He began scribbling symbols over the explosives, firefly spirals, mirrored runes, the lost names of Blake's final cipher. I understood at once. Create a void, I said. A cipher with no key, a thought with no echo. Precisely. Holmes smiled grimly. A forgetting bomb. He placed the devices against the vault floor. Wexham suddenly howled and lunged, breaking from his bonds. He sprinted toward the chrysalis. Holmes tackled him mid-stride. They fell in a tangle of limbs, dangerously close to the molten core. I rushed in to restrain Wexham again, but the man bit and twisted like a wild dog. You don't understand, he shrieked. It remembers for us. Without it, we're nothing. Holmes struck him once mercifully. The man went limp. Holmes turned to me. We must go, now. The moth screamed. No sound, just light. Blinding, agonizing light that seared through the senses. We fled, dragging Wexham's unconscious body behind. As we ascended the stairwell, Holmes tossed the final trigger switch over his shoulder. The dome erupted in a silent white flash, then nothing. A blankness, a forgetting. We emerged into the cold night air. The stars above burned as if newly kindled. Wexham stirred, confused, muttering names that no longer meant anything. Holmes turned back toward the mountain. Whatever had lived there had been locked again, not with chains, but with the absence of thought. Chapter 14. Whispers across a blank page were silent during our descent from the mountain. The snow crunching softly beneath our boots. The wind had stilled, as though the world itself held its breath in the aftermath of what had transpired. Holmes walked ahead with an unreadable expression, and Wexham, limp and hollow-eyed, muttered faint fragments of thought that vanished as quickly as they came. By the time we reached the base, the morning sun was cresting over the hills. Light touched the landscape in a muted gold, indifferent to the horrors we had seen. As we approached the small village where it had all begun, I turned to Holmes, desperate for certainty. Is it truly over? He didn't answer at once. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a page, one of Blake's final writings. It was blank. Every symbol, every mark, vanished. He murmured, eyes scanning the empty parchment, as if it never existed. That was your intention, I said quietly. To erase the knowledge entirely, not just the being but the memory of it. Holmes nodded, but his features remained tight. But memory is a curious thing, Watson. It has layers, echoes. The mind is not a vault but a web. Break one thread, and others tremble. He handed me the page. Tell me what you see. I looked. Blank. And yet, a faint impression. Not words, not lines. Just a shimmer, like a heat haze, a whisper of shape. My throat tightened. I see nothing, I lied, returning it. Holmes didn't press. He merely tucked the page away. Good. At the village inn, Miss Greta awaited us with red eyes and trembling hands. When she saw Wexham, she gasped and ran forward but faltered at the sight of his vacant stare. He doesn't remember me, she whispered. He doesn't remember anything, Holmes replied. Not even his own name. Greta sank into a chair, tears welling. Then what was it for? Why bring him back at all? To close a circle, Holmes said, and perhaps to remind us of the cost of opening doors better left sealed. Later that day, after tending to Wexham and giving Greta instructions for his care, Holmes and I retired to our quarters at the inn. I prepared tea with trembling fingers. The quiet was thick between us. I could not hold back any longer. Holmes, I said, why didn't it consume you? You stared into it longer than any of us. He paused, considering. Perhaps it did. Take something. Perhaps I will not know what for years. But I armed myself the only way I know how. With logic, I offered. No, he said softly, with disbelief. He turned his gaze to the hearth. The the fire crackling low. You see, Watson, belief is the bridge it crossed. Belief in pattern, meaning, memory. The more one believed in its symbols, the stronger its grasp. But I treated them as riddles, abstract, never gave them reverence. He gave a small, bitter smile, the one time my skepticism saved us both. As night fell, Holmes sat at the desk, writing a letter no doubt for Mycroft or some forgotten division of the British government that dealt in such unspeakable matters. I stared once more at the journal page he had given me. Still blank, but a corner of my mind etched, as if a dream I couldn't recall was coiled behind it. Waiting. Holmes saw me watching. Burn it, he said. But what if no records, no trace? That is how we win. I hesitated, then cast the page into the fire. It curled, blackened, and vanished into ash. A sudden wind outside rattled the shutters. We said nothing. That night, I dreamed of moths, not of the horror we faced, not clearly, but of wings, soft, gray, dusted in amber. They whispered to each other as they circled a flame I could not see. And when I awoke, I could not recall what they'd said. Chapter 15. The Man Who Forgot. The star spring settled uneasily over the valley in the weeks that followed. The snow receded from the crags and hollows like a guilty accomplice withdrawing from a crime scene. In the inn's garden, daffodils pushed through black earth as though unsure of their right to bloom. Wexham sat beneath the birch tree each morning. He spoke little. Sometimes he hummed tunelessly, a child's lullaby long faded from memory. Other times, he stared at the clouds with a quiet intensity, as if searching for a star that no longer existed. Greta remained at his side, patient and warm, though her laughter no longer rang like it once had. She spoke to him of their past, of shared meals and songs, of promises made beneath moonlight but he never recalled. At best, he would smile politely. At worst, he'd blink and ask who she was. He doesn't remember the sky, she told us one afternoon as we joined her outside. Not the constellations, not even the sun. He asked me the other day if the light comes from the ground. Holmes crouched beside Wexham and studied his eyes. They were clear, unclouded but vacant, like a house with the lights on and no one home. What is your name? Holmes asked gently. Wexham cocked his head. They call me Arthur, but sometimes I think I was someone else, or something else. And what do you dream about? Wexham smiled. A tower, but it's made of paper. It crumples when I touch it, and I'm searching for a door, but all the rooms keep folding in on themselves. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. That imagery so vivid, so symbolic, unsettled us both. As we returned inside, Holmes poured himself a brandy and stared out at the darkening sky. I had hoped, he said at last, that erasing the creature's sigils from existence would sever all threads. But this madness echo is proof that something remains, not in form, but in absence. You mean to say, I asked, that the thing left a scar, a void? Holmes corrected. A pattern of missingness, like an empty frame still hanging on the wall. He paused. Wexham is not haunted by memory. He is haunted by what he cannot remember. I sat across from him, troubled, but he seems peaceful. Perhaps that is mercy. Holmes considered that. Perhaps. Or perhaps he is a lighthouse with no light quiet. Yes, but of no use when the fog returns. We spent another week in the village. Holmes observed Wexham each day, taking notes, conducting soft experiments, light, music, touch. Wexham responded as a human would. He ate, slept, wept, sometimes, though he couldn't say why. But one morning, a change. I found Holmes standing in Wexham's room, motionless. The man was asleep, but his left hand moved, writing, fingers twitching in the air, sketching invisible shapes onto the blanket, rhythmic, deliberate, like the movement of a conductor guiding an unseen symphony. Holmes turned to me. He's remembering, I felt cold, or the void is remembering through him. Later that day, Greta showed us something. Tucked beneath Wexham's pillow, folded tightly, a slip of paper. Faint markings, not words, but lines, curves, a symbol. I stiffened. Holmes took it without touching the ink. New? He asked. Greta nodded. He gave it to me this morning. Said it was the name of the quiet thing. Holmes placed the paper into a lead-lined box we'd brought from London, then snapped it shut. He's not writing about the entity, Holmes said. He's becoming its pen. Then what are we to do? Holmes exhaled. The fire may have burned the page, Watson, but the idea still flickers. He looked out at Wexham through the window, who now sat humming to the wind, his eyes fixed upward at the darkening sky. Some things, Holmes murmured, do not die. They simply forget themselves until someone remembers for them. Chapter 16. A flame without a wick. Morning after the discovery of the sigil. Beneath Wexham's pillow, the air in the inn had changed. It was not colder, nor did any fog crawl down the mountainside, but a strange hush had settled, as though even the birds had decided silence was wiser. Greta did not sing while making breakfast. The innkeeper avoided eye contact. Holmes, however, moved with crisp efficiency, arranging papers, checking his pocket chronometer, and packing vials into a satchel. He had slept not at all. You're going to the chapel again? I asked as I sipped weak tea. Holmes nodded. It is the only place that has refused to forget. I need to confirm something in the mortar of the altar. You suspect it still harbors residue? No, Holmes replied. I suspect it echoes, and if echoes persist, then there is still something to hear. I volunteered to accompany him, but he declined. I need you here. Should Wexham begin to write again or speak, you must document it, word for word. And so I stayed. The inn remained heavy with quiet as I moved to the parlor, journal in hand. Wexham sat by the window, rocking slightly in his chair, staring not at the landscape, but at his own reflection. Greta sat nearby, knitting with practiced patience. Though her eyes remained fixed on him, he mumbled occasionally phrases about ladders without steps, about wells with dry water. I noted each one, though none formed a coherent thought. Only once did he stop and glance directly at me. It burns, he whispered, but there's no flame. Then he returned to silence. Hours passed before Holmes returned, boots muddied, and coat dusted with brick powder. He was pale but composed. You found something? I asked. He opened his satchel and withdrew a shard of stone, chalky, brittle, with faint indentations upon its surface. When held at an angle in the light, those indentations formed a spiral broken at one edge. This was sealed within the altar, Holmes said, mortared into place behind the panel where the fire struck hardest. A symbol, a counter-symbol. Holmes replied, something the priest must have inscribed to contain the original sigils. It was no holy protection, it was mathematical. A key to a lock whose door we never saw. He paused, but the lock is failing. The door creaks. I stared at the shard. Then Wexham is, what? A vessel. Holmes's voice was quiet. More a lantern, and the thing that once lit it is reaching back in search of the flame it left behind. We sat in silence, disturbed only by the gentle creak of the floorboards beneath Wexham's rocking chair. Then Greta stood. I want him to sleep, she said. No more questions today. He needs peace. Holmes nodded in agreement. There's one last test, a harmless one, and if it bears no result, I shall trouble him no more. From his coat, he drew a thin strip of metal etched with markings runic, almost mathematical, like the lines drawn by Wexham himself. He placed it gently onto the table beside Wexham. For a moment, there was nothing, but then his hand, slowly, began to twitch. He reached not for the strip, but toward the light on it. His fingers hovered above, trembling. Do you feel something, Arthur? I asked. Wexham's lips parted. "A name," he whispered. "A name with no vowels." Holmes leaned forward. "Can you say it?" "No," Wexam replied, suddenly calm. "But it knows when I try." Holmes withdrew the metal, and Wexam's hand fell limp. His eyes shut, and soon he was asleep again. The metal strip began to bend. No pressure was applied, but we watched it, breathless, as the metal curled inward, forming a tight spiral before splitting cleanly in two. Greta screamed. Holmes picked up the pieces with tongs and dropped them into the lead-lined box. "It's begun," he murmured. "Not the return, the recollection." I looked out the window. The snow was gone, but in the wind there was something colder than frost. Chapter 17. The sound that lingered in silence evening fell swiftly over the inn, faster than seemed natural, though the clocks told us it was barely past 5. The light had vanished as though drawn from the world by invisible strings. A hush cloaked the landscape, not the calm of sleep, but the tense stillness before something breaks. Holmes stood at the hearth, firelight dancing across his face, the lead-lined box still resting on the table beside him. He had not spoken since sealing the warped metal strip within. I sensed something turning over in his mind, an idea still unformed but pressing against the edges of certainty. I dared not disturb him. Upstairs, Wexam slept under Greta's watch, though whether it was true rest or another descent into that eerie stillness, we could not say. Holmes broke the silence at last. "Do you know, Watson, there's a sound in nature that resembles silence, and yet is not?" I looked up. "How do you mean?" "In certain caves," he said, eyes fixed on the flames, "there exists a resonance so low it escapes the ear. But it's not silence. It's a hum without a voice, a tone that can drive birds mad and unsettle the minds of men. I believe what we're facing is similar in nature, a presence without a sound, yet not without volume." I shivered. "And you think it's active now?" He turned, his gaze sharp. "It remembers, Watson, and memory is action. That which recalls can reach." There was a sudden knock at the door, sharp, hurried. Greta appeared from the landing, eyes wide. "I didn't send for anyone," she said. "No one should be calling at this hour." Holmes opened the door cautiously. A tall figure stood silhouetted in the last traces of twilight. He was bundled tightly in an old woolen coat, hat pulled low, in his gloved hands. He held a worn satchel. "I beg pardon," the man said. "I'm Professor Avery Murnell. I was told Arthur Wexam had been found." Holmes ushered him in at once. "Professor of what discipline?" Holmes asked. "Language, primarily ancient forms and speculative tongues. Wexam and I corresponded some years ago. We shared an interest in what he called the proto-sigil, an imagined-based language, rooted not in phonetics, but shapes. I received his last letter months ago, claiming he'd seen something foundational." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. "And did he mention the chapel?" Murnell nodded grimly. "He said the place spoke without speaking, that its very design vibrated with forgotten grammar. I assumed he was being poetic. But now, after your letter, I wonder." Holmes gestured toward the lead box. "A sigil warped this metal." Murnell bent over it. "This is impossible. And yet," Holmes said, "it happened. We suspect these symbols are more than design. They behave like code, but code not meant for the human mind." Murnell looked up, fear dawning. "And Wexam, still alive, but less himself than ever. He mutters in fragmented riddles, draws without memory, and sleeps without peace. It's as if something is occupying the space where thought used to live." The professor paled. "Then he's still in contact. If that's true, the pattern may still be open." Holmes stiffened. Precisely at that moment, from above, came a sound, not a footstep, not a cry, but a tone, low, sustained, like metal vibrating in deep stone. Greta gasped. "That's from Arthur's room." Holmes and I raced upstairs, Murnell close behind. Wexam sat upright in bed, his eyes wide but empty. From his throat came the sound continuous, unnatural, inhuman. Greta stood in the corner, whispering prayers. Holmes approached slowly. Arthur, the sound deepened. Professor Murnell stepped forward. Look at his hands. They were moving, but not drawing. Signing. Not in any alphabet I recognize, but in gestures precise. Repeated, mechanical. It's a form of communication. Murnell breathed. A message. Holmes suddenly seized Wexam's hand. The sound stopped. Silence returned like the slam of a vault door. Wexam fell back onto the pillows, eyes fluttering shut. Murnell's hands trembled. He's been used like a mouthpiece. Holmes nodded slowly. And the speaker is still learning our tongue. He turned to me. It's no longer about who opened the chapel. It's about what's listening. Chapter 18. The ink that wouldn't dry. The morning that followed was overcast, a colorless sky pressing low against the Wiltshire hills. Holmes had not slept, neither had I, nor, I suspected, had Professor Murnell, who had spent the better part of the night poring over Wexam's erratic diagrams by candlelight, translating what symbols he could and cross-referencing them against his volumes of theoretical language. He looked drained but driven, as though some fragment of terrifying purpose had latched itself onto his reason. Wexam slept more peacefully than we had yet seen. His pulse was steady. The whispering had stopped. Holmes sat in the drawing room, with the lead-sealed box before him, unmoving, silent, thinking. I knew this silence. It was not one of confusion, but culmination. It speaks in sequence, Watson, he said finally. As a telegraph does, it is not one sigil that causes the harm, but their order, a message. The thing was not trying to reach us. It was trying to send itself, transmit itself. You mean? Yes, the human mind is simply the unfortunate vessel it uses. Wexam was not possessed, he was occupied. Briefly, like a match lit in the dark to signal another room. But what's more troubling is this. He opened his notebook and showed me a sketch he had copied from Wexam's parchment, the same twisted arrangement of curved lines and recursive geometry, the one we had seen warped into the metal. This is not an ancient sigil, Holmes said. This is Wexam's correction. He tried to close the transmission. He saw the sigil, deciphered its purpose, and altered it subtly, hoping, perhaps, that he could reverse the process. What's astonishing is he may have succeeded. I looked to the professor. Murnell nodded. This new variation, it forms a feedback loop. It wouldn't complete the transmission, it would trap it. A trap, Holmes said softly. Not for a man, but for a voice. And then Holmes lifted the box. The metal inside had warped further in the night, where once the impression had been shallow. Now the grooves were deeper, scorched almost to the point of burning through. A faint, oily residue clung to the edges, like sap that had been forced from a tree under extreme heat. It tried again last night. Holmes whispered, the signal, but this time it could not escape. A long silence followed. Murnell stared, lips parted. You mean it's in there? Holmes shut the lid and resealed it. I believe so. The sigil acts like a lock now, not a door. He turned to me. You recall, Watson, that I said the human mind could not contain this pattern without damage, but metal a passive medium can. This box now serves the same purpose as Wexam's altered drawing, containment. Greta appeared at the door. Arthur's awake, she said gently, and asking for you, Mr. Holmes. We found Wexam sitting upright, pale but lucid. He blinked at us and smiled faintly. I thought I dreamt it all, but I remember. Pieces, something wanted to use my eyes to see, my tongue to speak. But I rewrote the message. I broke its rhythm. You did more than that, Holmes replied, stepping forward. You turned a song into a cage. You trapped it. Wexam's smile faded. Then, it can't reach anyone else. No, Holmes said. not unless the seal is broken. There was a silence filled with mutual understanding. Later that afternoon, Holmes and I accompanied Myrtle to the edge of the nearby chalk cliffs, a narrow path winding down toward the sea. There, beneath the roots of an old hawthorn, Holmes buried the box in silence. "Wouldn't the authorities want to know?" Myrtle asked. Holmes shook his head. "They would try to study it, test it, expose it. Curiosity is the quickest path to madness. Let it sleep in the soil. The world will not miss what it never understood." We departed the inn shortly after. Wexham, though shaken, insisted he would remain with Greta for a few more weeks of rest. As the carriage pulled away, he raised a hand in farewell. A faint shimmer of peace restored to his eyes. As for Holmes, he was unusually quiet on the journey. Back to Baker Street. "It's a rare case," I remarked, "where you don't name a culprit." He glanced out the window. "Oh, there was a culprit, Watson. But it wasn't a man nor a beast. It was a voice from a throat that never lived, echoing through forgotten stone and fevered ink." He turned back, and a rare weariness touched his gaze. "Some crimes cannot be punished, only contained." And so ended the case of the Firefly, trapped in amber, named not for its light, but for the ancient truth it carried, that even the smallest glimmer, if left unchecked, can burn through time.